Hopefully my microphone won't be as much of a bother this time, but I've got a completely rational belief that my level of anxiety around it causes it to either behave or misbehave one way or the other.
Oh, I understand that inclination completely. Absolutely, completely. That kind of magical thinking thing. I've discussed this with Laura Marrow before because she suffers with it quite badly. I suffer with it quite badly. It's an amazing thing, isn't it? It's, to be able to actually to perceive patterns where there absolutely are none.
I think it's probably common to writers that
Yes.
we do that. I mean, for obvious reasons.
Obvious reasons. I think it's definitely something that I draw on for my work. There's no doubt in my mind. I mean, I feel very lucky because I can step back from it. You know, I can say to myself, no, that's ridiculous. You are not going to have some awful thing happen if you don't put this book in this place or whatever, you know. Or if you don't make this propitiation or whatever. But I can imagine that it can be terrible to the point of being life-breaking.
Well, I mean, I guess where it crosses over into sort of compulsive thinking with OCD, which I'm not going to espouse on because I don't have any background knowledge of it, but from what I've heard of people who suffer from it, it can be pretty nightmarish. Yeah,
my brother suffers with a fair amount of it, and it doesn't really impinge on his life too badly. It's just little things that he finds frustrating because he can't rationalize to himself why. That's what he expresses to me anyway. A good example is if he's presented with a selection of items, say in a store or shop or something, he always has to go for the middle one. The one that's directly in the middle, and he doesn't understand what part of his brain is saying to him, select the one in the middle or something terrible will happen.
Yeah, from what I've heard, that's often like the case with people with OCD, that there's like something deep anxiety behind the compulsion that if they don't do it, something either very specific will go wrong or just nebulous, like a
it's a kind of like a nebulous dread that somehow they've broken the universe by doing this thing instead of that thing, or doing this thing in that way. And it is a very, very strange thing, but I do find it fascinating.
But I guess with us being symbolic animals, that's kind of how that easily goes wrong. Like we operate in this reality that perhaps some animals other than us have to some very limited extent, and insofar as they're capable of abstractions and de-indexicalize awareness, the sense that there's something outside themselves that is continuous outside themselves. But for us, we operate in this world of social facts and symbolic facts that is almost, I think, completely unique. And and it's fascinating. I mean, the whole centrality of stories to humanity, I think, derives from this human uniqueness. And
I think so. It's something that is it's kind of a double-edged sword in a way. I mean, for me, it would definitely be the most sacred thing about humanity, insofar as there is anything sacred about humanity. But at the same time, it does have this other very dark quality whereby not only can it induce anxiety and dread through things like, for example, false association, creating these incredible abstractions like superstition that then swell and become even greater abstractions to the point whereby they can form entire ideologies, but it's also, for me, it's a source of great dysphoria, because what can happen, and what certainly happens for me, is that we can imagine so much better. We can imagine so much better for ourselves in terms of how we manifest and how we operate. We can imagine universes where there are no limitations on us physically, for example, where we can dance through the hearts of stars and so on and so forth, but we can't ever realize it. And there's something very cruel about that, I find. The fact that we are matter that's evolved to this point where we can acknowledge ourselves and then imagine ourselves to be other to be more, to be different, to be better, but can never actually aspire beyond this skin, this form, these limitations. I mean, that's something that comes up again and again and again in my fiction, definitely.
I mean, as the basis of human abstraction, and therefore human uniqueness, it's the foundation of all of our capacity for unique atrocity and humanity. And I mean, when we weigh that against other species, because I think human uniqueness often gets quite undersold. This is going way back to when I used to be obsessed with a philosopher called Raymond Tallis, who's quite big on this point. And like when you look at our accomplishments relative to any other species, even quite impressive eusocial animals, from some of the other higher apes to
dolphins, etc.
Yeah, but nothing, rivals skyscrapers and space flight, but equally, the capacity for holocausts and mass atrocities and those kinds of ideological underpinnings. So yeah, when you open up this whole other scope, I mean, moral judgments just aren't really applicable without abstract knowledge. So yeah,
it becomes an almost evolutionary Pandora's box, doesn't it? The very worst of things and the very best of things are all contained therein.
I mean, it's, being biblical, it's kind of, the de-indexicalized awareness as the sort of root of all of this is almost the sort of the original sin, the kind of fruit that allows for human consciousness, and therefore the capacity to know evil and good, and the capacity to evil and good. And, I think there's a dim existential truth to that kind of creation story.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And it's something that so often gets lost with the insistence upon literalism from both sides of whatever argument you're coming from. The subtlety and the human reflection gets lost somewhere, doesn't it?
Well, literalism especially applied to origin stories. Origin is always especially ridiculous, and anybody can see that if you applied it to origin myths that nobody or incredibly few people now believe. Like if you applied that kind of stuff to the origin myths of the Nordic faiths, the ancient Nordic faiths, that would just seem absurd to anybody.
Of course, or the Egyptian, like the ancient Egyptian mythologies, where reality is literally, it's either shat out by cosmic animals or it's bled or lactated into being,
Yeah,
of course.
Really visceral, wonderful. And I've recently been playing Dark Souls, and I love how much it gets that viscerality. Because that's it's actually an apocalypse, but it's an apocalypse that's very reflective on origins and creation myths.
Oh, it's beautiful, isn't it? I mean, I think the Dark Souls games in particular, they capture a certain metaphysical ennui that is so sublime and so apt for the situations in which we find ourselves. The notion that this universe into which you're thrown is cyclical, for one thing.
Yes.
Where it's this moribund metaphysics where, there are these incredible, miraculous entities and powers, and there are the eruptions of these incredible civilizations, almost utopian civilizations. Gwyn's Age of Fire, it is essentially a utopia, isn't it? But they always fail.
Yeah.
It always dies.
In the context of that incredibly cyclical sort of, pagan is a word that gets thrown around too much, but it has a sort of pagan ethos to it.
Definitely.
There's an inherent, pathos to those metaphysics, because everything, even the gods, are essentially trapped in this nightmare, effectively.
I mean, have you seen the end of the first Dark Souls?
I think I saw it on your Let's Play and a few other videos.
So Gwyn, obviously, is built up throughout the entire game. More than any of the other godly entities, he's built up as the god of gods. He is the father of light and of fire and of civilization, And when you come to fight him at the end, you expect that it's going to be incredible, that it's going to be epic. It's going to be something like Shadow of the Colossus, and it's not. He is this weak, mouldering old entity that is desperately trying to keep you away from the last of the first flame, because that's it. That's the last piece of it. When it goes out, and that's the age of darkness coming in. I love that so much, and I also love what it does to the player character. The fact that the player character is completely nameless, you have no idea who you are, and yet there is a certain impetus to you. You are this bit of grit that's cast through the machine. You are an inevitable entity. You're a bit like the One from the Matrix mythology. You are inevitable. You are there to renew the cycle one way or the other. Whether you choose the Age of Darkness or whether you choose another Age of Fire, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and that's very Gnostic.
Yeah.
I think the character, the protagonist in that game. And I was just thinking, actually, in terms of meeting Gwyn, how similar that is, because you've just recently done a retrospective on the Philip Pullman novels.
His Dark Materials, yes.
Yeah, and of course, the god at the end of that is exactly the same.
I remember being very shocked when I read that. I don't know why. I did not expect the authority to actually physically occur in the books. I really didn't. And when he does, I also love the fact that Pullman doesn't tell you that it's the authority when you're reading it. He's just, he's thrown out of the sort of floating mountain that's the great fortress of angels that's floating across the realms and basically destroying everything. When it comes crashing down, the authority is hurled from it in this like net of light that's keeping him alive over the centuries, and Lyra and Will end up releasing him. Inadvertently, they don't realize who he is, they don't realize what they're doing, they think he's a prisoner, and they're trying to release him, and it's true. He's been kept alive against his will by his followers. There is a great deal of metaphor going on there, There's something slightly Nietzsche going on there, there's a God is dead thing, but it's softer than that. It's actually smarter, I would say, than that notion. It's kind of telling you that certain ideas of God need to die. They need to move on.
I think the difference between Pullman and Nietzsche is Nietzsche's focus on the death of God is on the cataclysmic absence as an impetus to something more.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel, partly because I think he's a humanist, Pullman has content already there, like the decaying moribund a relic of God is simply an impediment to seeing the humanity that already exists. There's no need for some cataclysmic event in lieu of that, because we've just got us.
It's something that's so often lost in analyses of his Dark Materials, I find, because it does tend to be caught up in those very simplistic debates between secularism and religion, which I think does an incredible disservice to the books. That element is obviously there, that is part of it, but it's not the totality of it, and it certainly does a disservice to the incredible complexity that Pullman himself draws. Like you say, it isn't the case that God simply dies and that is the end of the themes and the end of the story. Pullman really takes time to set up a new metaphysics, one that's based around liberation and curiosity and self-propulsion, as it were, self-identification, and that is very, very often lost, I find.
I think that a lot of that comes down to the fact that he uses these very careful but very popular sort of metaphors for the way that he explores, because this is ultimately about how he explores humanity, because that is the content. And so there's no separation between how he depicts his characters and what his metaphysics is, like, in contrast to, of course, the writer that he's writing against.
Of course, C.S. Lewis,
Yeah. And Lewis, his characters are nothing but puppets in this very capricious cat's cosmic drama.
It's totally true. It's totally true. And by extension, they're also nothing but avatars or vessels for Lewis's agendas,
Their characters are kind of superfluous. They could really be anything. As long as they fulfill their essential functions, it doesn't really matter who they are.
Absolutely true. Yeah.
And the way that Pullman explores who his characters are through this idea of demons, of course, which I think is often trivialized. It's almost turned into something that, is more worthy of a book like Harry Potter, where
Definitely.
it's like, what would your demon be, or something like that, like a BuzzFeed personality test.
Yes, that's absolutely it. It is I mean, in many respects, it's very clever because it is the kind of idea that will immediately snare people. Will immediately think, well, what would my demon be? What would it look like? But you're right. It's simplified in popular discourses on the book. That's definitely true.
Because the metaphorical resonances of what he's actually saying about his characters, and of course, the way that the demons are done. Because if you were going to do it just simply as a kind of, everyone has their own little special attendant who represents them in some unique way. Of course, you would want to do that in a way that was consistently beneficial and empowering, and the way that the demons work is absolutely not that.
Totally not. I mean, at various points, the demons are acting as the conscience of the characters, or they're actually representing sublimated ideas that they're having, or sublimated feelings. So Pantalaimon often contradicts Lyra. Often. I think the best example of it is Marissa Coulter. Marissa Coulter, who often has an abusive relationship with her demon. She physically attacks it at various points, and it's a brilliant way of demonstrating that this woman is at war with herself.
Yeah.
It's brilliant. It's just so clever.
That she's sort of psychologically fraught, and to bring that out in a villain in such a subtle way without actually having to do the kind of usual complexity thing which people do with villains is fantastic.
It is wonderful. They do not. One thing that Pullman does beautifully is he resists the urge of doing the whole Cruella de Vil Maleficent Disney thing, where she simply becomes a cipher for a male character's inflicted trauma, basically.
Yeah.
She's just a complex entity. I don't think often even she knows quite what her feelings are, particularly with regards to Lyra.
No, I think that whole conflict with herself, she is almost entirely unaware of her motivations throughout most of it, and that works with her being difficult to predict as a villain, which makes her quite an interesting antagonist. And another character that really depicts this about the demonic, and I think you brought it up in one of your videos. It's been a long time since I've actually read the books, but the character who's got a sea-bound demon and therefore can't ever go on land.
Right.
They're permanently shipburned. So demons are also like these incredible impediments to a lot of. And that's a fascinating device. And,
I do think that Pullman points out, actually, because he doesn't make a muchness of the demons in the books. He doesn't actually sit down and explain, oh, demons are this and demons are that. He lets you explore it through the characters primarily. But there are a few moments where he explores how there are people who are in conflict with their demons. So there are people who would rather have had a wolf for a demon because they have a very particular idea of themselves, and they end up having a ferret ultimately. And so they are actually in conflict with themselves, whereas people who are not tend to be at peace with their demons as well. And there are also examples of that in the book. So Lee Scoresby, for example, completely at peace with his demon. Probably the best example is Lord Asriel.
Yes, there's no conflict, even though he's got very insidious motivations quite often. He's absolutely of a piece with what he wants to do.
Oh, he's so certain. I think that is what makes him so. It's what makes him seem so simpatico with his particular demon, to the point whereby they are almost one entity.
He's kind of that wonderful example of like a disturbing utopian, like a utopian who. I mean, you get this character every so often. Example I really like, although the director is a bit so right now for various reasons. But Joss Whedon's the one that came out of Firefly, Serenity.
Oh,
The
Serenity, yeah.
villain of that, the one that works for the autocratic central state of this galaxy, just being on this sort of merciless mission of carnage, but absolutely convinced that every single thing he's doing is for the greater good in that sort of typical way. It's can be very hammy, and of course it's easy to parody, but
it's very easy to parody, and of course there are so many bad examples of that archetype in a lot of popular fiction. I think Azrael, though, really the reason Azrael sells it is because of the stakes. I remember very vividly, because the book plays it as a complete mystery. Right up until about halfway through the subtle knife is when you start to realize what Azrael is actually doing. But when you do realise, there is this wonderful breathlessness, because it's so huge. It's not even like a normal utopianism where it's establishing a better society or a better state of play. It's undoing the fundamental assumptions of everything in all realities and liberating them thereby.
I mean, going back to that idea of cycles and Dark Souls and the like, he's undoing the cycles.
Yeah.
And then that's an interesting project. I mean, of course, the way that works in Dark Souls is utter sort of Lovecraftian nihilism.
Well, you find out that it's impossible.
Yes.
When you come to the second game, you're in a totally different place, and yet there are these bizarre echoes of what happened in Lordran, in the setting of the first game. The setting of the second game is called Drang Leich, and initially you assume that, well, it's another country in this world, or it's another area. It's not. It's the same world. It's just another manifestation. It's another cycle. And all the same archetypes are there, or there's even a Gwyn equivalent, you know? They have the same entities knocking about, but in different manifestations. And what you discover is it doesn't matter what you chose at the end of the original Dark Souls. The same metaphysics just plays out again and again and again. The world reorders itself and becomes some other condition. And eventually the flame starts to die. Eventually the undead curse comes back, and the darkness starts to creep in, the abyss starts to seep up, and eventually it all breaks down again and starts all over. What I love in Dark Souls 3 is that they clearly acknowledge this, and they use it as an excuse to end that metaphysics. By the end of Dark Souls 3, it's all breaking down. Whatever metaphysical engine is impelling these cycles is dissolving. So by the end of Dark Souls 3, you have this situation where all realities are tending together, all possibilities are just collapsing in on one another. And by the end of Dark Souls 3, it's done. The metaphysics, everything, after millennia, because you never know how many cycles there have been in between the games either.
There's the point in one of the games where you go and see all of the different trees, which are all, of course, the same tree, and there's hundreds.
That's right, yeah.
Remember, yeah. So it's certainly heavily implied that this is a long-lived multiverse.
Yeah, that's right.
That's not even the right term. And there's that ambiguity, a wonderful ambiguity about whether or not it's even a bad thing that this is coming to its sort of terminal end, since this entire universe is defined by essentially cycles of violence, and very little else.
There is, even in Dark Souls 1, there's that ambiguity. It's very difficult to do, but you know the serpent that you trigger at one point that emerges from the temple near the first fire shrine that you activate? There's this world serpent, a sort of a Jormungandr-style creature, and he basically tells you your destiny, that you are destined to go and rekindle the first flame and restart the cycle of light over. However, there is an alternative to him in the abyss, and it's very difficult to trigger. You've got to do a certain number of things in a certain way in order to get him to turn up. But if he does, and you go and talk to him, he tells you the exact opposite. He tells you that Gwyn and the gods are liars, and that the cycle of fire is actually a prison for the dark soul of humanity, and that the abyss was always meant to occur. It was always meant to be this way. You know, the abyss is not a terrible thing. It's the inevitability of this universe, and a new condition will arise as a result of it. What I love about the game is you never know who's telling the truth, if any of them are.
Yeah, that's my sense. There's this fantastic ethos through the game where almost everyone you're talking to who isn't just almost as tragically as pathetic as you are. I mean, I think there's a sense of that about your situation.
Definitely.
So, you know, there's the various other questing type characters.
Oh, those poor guys.
Don't do very well. Yes.
None of them. They all have terrible endings. All of them do. I mean, even the brightest, even the most cheerful of them have absolutely appalling endings by the end of that game. And it's true in all of the Dark Souls games, I'm afraid. It really is.
Yeah, I've got the sense of that from Let's Plays and various video essays and stuff. It is it's not a cheery universe.
No. I mean, I will say this: the characters in Dark Souls, the ones that you meet along the way, who are on their own fabulous quests, people like Solaire, like the Onion Knight, for example, they are friendlier and more cheerful than the ones you find in Bloodborne.
Yes,
that's for damn sure.
I've regrettably not got to play Bloodborne, even though the aesthetics appeal to me greatly, but because obviously console exclusive, so it's
right.
Yeah,
it is. Of all those games, Bloodborne is my favourite. Bloodborne is my favourite. Its metaphysics is slightly different from Dark Souls's. Dark Souls's is much more expansive. It's bigger and grander and more cosmic, you know. Whereas Bloodborne takes it. I say takes it down. It still has its elements of the Lovecraftian, definitely, but it's more of a personal horror. You know, and it's also bizarrely in its own peculiar way much more hopeful than Dark Souls, because Bloodborne does present the possibility for transformation and for transcendence. It's dark, don't get me wrong, it's horrific, but it is there. You know, some of the characters you meet they've done it. They have fulfilled whatever bizarre destiny they think they have, and they've ascended to some other realm or state of being. Of course, you end up killing them, but, you know.
I get the feeling that Bloodborne is much, because it's in one of these painted worlds by all accounts.
I think it's never clearly defined, but I think you can definitely infer that Yharnam is one of the painted worlds from Dark Souls, definitely. Especially by the end of Dark Souls 3. There's a suggestion at the end of Dark Souls 3 that Yharnam is kind of created.
And so it's an artifice, and it's already in itself, just the fact that it is that is a kind of utopian project in the scheme of that universe. It's opting out of the cycles from the get-go because it's a pocket universe.
Yeah, and yet it's infinite, because Bloodborne operates on this really strange existential level where you skip around to various states of dreaming, the game calls it. So you are neither awake nor in a nightmare. It's sort of caught in between, and certain characters create their own levels of the nightmare through various rituals, through magic, through hideous experiments, and you can transcend to different levels of it, and on different levels you can meet different gods and deities and Lovecraftian entities that are all responsible for different horrors and insanities, but it does seem as though these levels are infinite.
I mean, again, all of that connects to this theme of artifice that runs through Bloodborne, and I think that's explored in a very alchemical way in Bloodborne.
Definitely.
It's about self-creation, and it's about using these natural forces for the perfection of the self, insofar as whatever that actually takes, and obviously there's numerous hideous ways that that's articulated in the game.
It's horrific, yeah. I mean, the very notion of the hunter's dream, which is sort of the hub world, where you go whenever you die, the whole notion of the hunter's dream is exactly that. It is essentially a place created by the first hunter, Gehrman, where the hunters who have imbibed the blood, the sacred blood, go to, and from where they perpetuate the hunt. And the hunt is not a literal thing. It's almost like an annealing process, a voyage of metaphysical self-discovery, and some lose themselves in it, some go mad, some devolve into the most hideous conditions. But characters like your hunter, by the end of the game, transcend it. They become something else.
The notion of creating or becoming God, there's a very technical word I remember from occultism, but I can't recall it. It begins with TH, I think, but never mind.
Yes, Theo something.
Yeah, Theog, something like that.
Something like Theogenesis, something like that, isn't it?
But that runs through that game. But then the kind of God you're creating, I mean, it's not even like a pagan god. It's more like a Lovecraftian.
It's a Lovecraftian god. It's something from outside. I mean, that you encounter characters who have done it, who are great ones, as they call them, and they are all unique. Each one of them is a species unto itself. So each one is a unique nightmare. But they are also all horrific. They're all dark gods, essentially.
Yes. And within the parameters of that universe, like, judging that is really difficult, because the ends of these various people becomes itself very strange, like what they're after, what states they're seeking. It's almost, in the Warhammer universe you have a similar thing, where beings will transcend to states that anybody alive would consider nightmarish, but they unapologetically desire this.
Yeah.
And genuinely desire it.
And within the constraints of those universes, not necessarily unreasonable.
No.
That's what I always find fascinating, I mean, in Bloodborne it's totally justified. There isn't really any other choice. If you are in the hunt, if you are ensconced within the nightmare, you don't have much choice. You either go for broke, you go for the ultimate prize, which is transcendence, godhood, or you devolve. That's the end of it. It's the same for the followers of Chaos in 40k or in the Age of Sigmar Mortal Realms. It's a zero-sum game. You either go for transcendence as an immortal, or you allow yourself to devolve into madness, or you die and are forgotten.
And if you look at the opt-out from that, escaping the nightmare, that just takes you back into the Dark Souls universe. And the option there is to sort of cling to some hopeless ideal, but be constantly reconstituted in whatever you choose. It's very much Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. You get to pick one thing and then you just do it forever.
Right. Bizarrely, the games do explore this. In Dark Souls 3, one of the principal antagonists is a guy called Pontiff Sullivan. And Pontiff Sullivan is an escapee from one of the Painted Worlds. And he has come back into what is now Lothric, like the latest incarnation of these realms. And what he does to try and halt the cycles is he kidnaps all of the gods and murders them. All of the gods, he feeds them to a creature called Aldrich, the Devourer of gods, which you actually face at one point. So it actually plays with that concept. There is someone, an active entity, who has escaped from the nihilism of both worlds at one point and has realised the utter futility of it all and is trying to halt it.
I mean, you get that in Warhammer 40,000 too, with a lot of the sort of named Chaos characters who choose to avoid godhood, to avoid becoming demon princes.
Abaddon is a really good example. I mean, the Arch Messiah. I mean, in many respects, he's considered to be the Arch Messiah of the Dark Gods, but he's really not. He's really not. So
there's also Fabius Bile, who does it in a very different sense, and
Ahriman is another great example. I mean, he is obviously bound up with Tzeentch, a specific chaos power, but he is not a servant of Tzeentch. Not a conscious one, anyway, not a willing one. He's constantly straining against the bindings of fate, constantly, even though it's probably futile.
And Typhus from the Nurgle range, I think he's got a similar project, although he's quite favoured by Nurgle. It's complex as to whether he's working wholly aligned with Nurgle's sort of entire scheme. I mean, all of those figures, probably Typhus less so, but to some extent, are perverse recreations of the Emperor's original agenda.
Absolutely, they're utopians. They are alone. Interestingly, alone amongst most of the 40k universe, they are actually utopians, and they're utopians in such a way that they are playing the longest game imaginable. So you've got the Tower, who've got their utopian project, but theirs is a very mundane utopian project in many respects. It is just the case of incorporating all of the races in the universe and just establishing an empire. You look at Ahriman, his utopian project is reordering the entire metaphysics of creation.
Yes. There's also a falsity to the Tau, which is what I really like most about them. Not enough to really get into them because I'm just not that into their aesthetics, but there's a sense, I can't remember what the high caste of the Tower called. I think Eternals.
The Eternals, like I think, yeah.
But they know everything they deny about the universe. They know about chaos. They know about the frailty of the Tau in the face of the universe, and they are very much doing a sort of golden lie path kind of thing, like a sort of Platonic thing. They absolutely are deceiving their own people to their own ends, and in fact will abandon their utopian principles quite quickly when it comes to maintaining this lie. Up to brutally murdering their own, or even condemning whole worlds to die. Not that different to anything that the Imperium gets up to.
Not at all. It's really a matter of packaging more than anything, isn't it? It's the way they advertise themselves, I mean, to be fair, the Tau are essentially what the Imperium were at the very beginning of the Great Crusade.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, and they see that. I mean, they desire quite strongly a unification with the human empire and all of that. They're and of course there's been apparently quite numerous inquisitors who've seen the wisdom of doing this too.
Apparently so. I mean, it's an interesting thing in the fiction. There are examples of particularly inquisitors who you would not expect to be the most tolerant, actually confabulating with alien races on various projects. So there are inquisitors, for example, who are reasonably well in with the Eldari, for example, to the point whereby they regard them as a common enemy against the predations of chaos and the Necrons and so on and so forth. But yes, apparently the Tau are quite approachable.
Well, they will actually work with you, unlike, say, orcs. I mean, they have this wonderful naivety too, beyond the Eternals, obviously knowing the deal. And I do love the stories of the Tau's original encounters with the orcs, where they try to absorb them into the Tau Empire and make, various diplomatic entreaties. There's a wonderful battle report in White Dwarf, which was quite well narrativized, as they're sometimes not really. But this one was quite comically done, and it was over a horde that one of the more piratical orcs had.
Yeah.
And the Tau had decided that they were going to risk quite a lot to destroy this horde because the orcs valued it so much. They won. And at the end, they discovered that it was a giant collection of orc teeth, which they were incredibly disappointed
have no use for whatsoever.
But the orcs were sort of like wandering away, licking their wounds, and actually complaining about all of the fantastic things that the town would now be able to do with this great wealth that they'd stolen from them, which I think is quite brilliant.
Yeah, I love it.
But but the but there's this kind of character arc with certain rogue traders and inquisitors that you see repeated, which is exactly as you said, that they start off as fanatical adherents of the imperial creed in its most dogmatic and intolerant. And if they survive, they invariably become more and more heretical, just out of the necessities of pragmatism.
It does seem to be the case. I mean, what tends to happen is the Inquisitors, because they're privy to so much information and knowledge that no other human being in the entire Imperium is, even many of the Primarchs were not privy to this information. They come to understand what the truth is of the metaphysics of this universe, and they come to see the scale and the scope of it. And they realize, a lot of the time, they just realize, you know what we're doing as the wider Imperium is not going to work.
Yes, yeah, they see the essential doomedness of the project, as I think actually the Lords of Terror do as well.
I think so. Yes,
there's a strong sense that their project really is actually managed decline and not the triumph of humanity in the universe. I mean, they certainly have no long-term scheme to deal with threats like the Tyranids.
Definitely not. Well, it's impossible, isn't it? I mean, one of the things I do love it when they play within the fiction is the scope, the insane, impossible scale and scope of the Imperium, where you've got worlds out there that they're populated by cultures of humanity that are like our medieval history, or they're at the Iron Age or whatever, and they have no notion of there being a wider Imperium, or if they do, it's very mythologized, and they haven't had any real contact with the wider Imperium for millennia. I love all that stuff.
You could do fantastic fiction of worlds at various states of ignorance, cut off from the Imperium, encountering like a single cut-off space marine or something like that. Like there's a huge scope for playing around with that disconnect, which is, as you say, it runs across the entire game, and it's quite brilliant. And of course, a lot of the different alien species have that as well.
Of course.
Like the knowledge base of various of the quote unquote more primitive species is kind of highly open, including, of course, many orcs, which are often feral creatures that exist only on singular worlds without any technology at all. They just, subsist. It's,
I mean, the ones that fascinate me more than any of the alien races are the Eldari. I love the Eldari so much. They were my entryway into 40k. My first army was back when they were the Eldar, way back when. Which is I love the way they've gotten around that rebranding. By the way, apparently the Eldar was just an ignorant human misreading of what the Eldari actually called themselves. Way back when the second edition Craftworld Eldar Codex came out, that was my very first book for 40k, and I had a fairly decent all-lead Craftworld Eldar army back then. So I've got a bit of a soft spot for the space elves, I really do. But I love the way that they have made them more than space elves. They're not just sort of lithe, pointy-eared humanoid figures. They're something very, very different. Their capacities and their natures are very inhuman, which I like. I like a great deal. And the way they operate in the universe is these ragged remnants of a once universe-spanning empire.
The sense of pathos to them is incredible. Like there's
it really is.
Yeah. I mean, again, that's actually comparable to the stuff we were talking earlier about sort of Dark Souls and stuff. There's this wonderful notion of this resplendent civilization, and then the decline, and then this current state, which has sort of created new and interesting forms of extremist ideology within them. That sort of just that continues to corrupt them. Of course, I mean they can't help being these like incredibly psychically sensitive beings, and therefore shifting the universe around them incomparably more than almost any of the other species. And so every idea they get just alters the entire fabric of the universe, usually in ways that are not to their long-term benefit.
Right, and even when it seems to be, there is always deliberately an ambiguity drawn. So one of the biggest shake-ups that came recently was, of course, with the creation of the Inari, the splinter faction of their race, which worships, well, doesn't even worship, but is utilizing the Eldar god of the dead, has actually facilitated its rebirth into the universe. Or has it? There's always this wonderful ambiguity where a lot of the Eldari race do not believe that what has come back is Inyad. They believe that it may be some kind of demonic force, or even a form of Slaneshi trick. And what I love is when you look at the Inari miniatures, they've incorporated that element into them.
Has so you've got Slaneshi look, definitely.
Right, the avatar of Inyad, it looks like a Slanesh miniature. It's very clever. I love that stuff. And the fact that so many of the classic Eldari characters who have fallen into what is essentially a kind of cult have now separated from the main Eldari race. So even the big ones like Eldrad Ulthran. Who for the longest time was the core Eldari character. He was the equivalent of Abaddon and of Marneus Calgar, the big, iconic characters. He is no longer the High Farseer of Ulthwé. He's been kicked out. They don't like him and they don't trust him because of what he did with the Inari.
And it's great that they've actually continued the story in those innovative ways. Like, they haven't sunk into conservatism when it comes to the narrative forms. And I think the Eldari especially indicative of that, because as a species sort of on its eternal decline, it's tempting to just try and hold them in stasis. And, because that narrative can only really go in one direction. And it's a clever way of doing it, to have them create a kind of subversive death cult, but then to play around with the metaphysics in that way. And actually, absolutely, as you say, it's in a sense every god in the Warhammer 40,000 universe is a chaos entity, in the sense that there's not anything that like fundamentally separates the four chaos gods off from the other gods, besides what they personify. They just have to personify destructive forces. I love this sense, and it's very, very delicately sketched out, because it could never really go anywhere without exploding the whole Warhammer 40,000 universe, of the Empress slowly becoming a warp entity, a sort of, and also one seemingly of sort of order, but also sterility and nothingness, and this kind of like barrenness.
A kind of rigid authoritarian order that strangles all passion and all inspiration. It's something they've done with his equivalent in the Mortal Realms in Age of Sigmar. Sigmar himself, of course, he is the high god of all order and law and civilization, which sounds all wonderful and grand, but there is this deliberately drawn ambiguity where his followers are also incredibly intolerant, oppressive, and they will sack entire cities and entire civilizations if they think there's even the chance of chaos worship or something that would lead to the corruption of chaos.
The fantastic thing I've heard about the Stormcast is that
that's it. The Stormcast Eternals.
That they come back, but through this process of coming back, and of course the whole thing is very much a Mephistophelian pact with the Lord of Death, Nagash. Their personalities are literally drained away. So again, there's that notion of, as you say, of sterility and order. They become slowly completely indistinct automatons.
Every time they're reforged. So when the Stormcast die, they essentially become lightning, because that's what Sigmar is. He's the embodiment of like the storm. He's the storm god. He's Odin. He's Odin basically, but without the passion and without the fun element. they are swept back to Asia, which is the realm of the storms, and they are reforged into a new Stormcast Eternal. But every time that happens to them, a little bit of their personality is lost in the reforging process. So in the book, it describes how there are they call them, instead of chapters, they've got chambers, basically. They are the chambers of the Stormcast Eternals. There are entire chambers of the older Stormcast Eternals who are automata. There's nothing left of them.
So they've already gone all the way. They've completely erased. Yeah, that's interesting.
I love that. I mean, I didn't really like the Stormcast when they first came out. There was an element of, it's just Space Marines in AOS, that's all it is. And that's still true. That's what they are. But I think layering in that wonderful ambiguity really does provide so much in the way of storytelling. In the Slaves to Darkness book, which describes the general forces of chaos, not the god-specific ones, but the more sort of like Norscan tribalistic chaos forces. There's a great little short story by Aaron Dembski-Bowden where you have a demon princess fighting against a Stormcast Eternal champion, and this demon princess and this Stormcast Eternal champion meet one another at various points in their different incarnations, because of course a demon prince is the same. When a demon prince dies or its mortal form is destroyed, it just goes back to the realm of chaos and it's reborn. And it turns out that they know one another. They're actually sisters. They've died and been reforged over so many eons, and they've lost so much of themselves that they don't really know. Or rather, the Stormcast one doesn't know. The Stormcast one by the end is basically an automaton, but the Demon Prince knows. And the Demon Princess really revels in it. Absolutely loves the irony of it,
As I'd imagine a Demon Princess would in the scope of Warhammer. It's very... that kind of experience is very aligned with those kinds of warp entities.
Bizarrely, the perversity of it would actually feed the chaos entity, because they are creatures of metaphor, of course. So if they can engineer situations like that, it not only often pleases their god. I mean, a god like Slanesh would love that. Absolutely love the drama of it. It's entertaining, isn't it? It also feeds them. It makes them more powerful, it makes them stronger, and it delights them.
But you can see it with the other ones. I mean, Nurgle is obviously a god of rebirth, and
totally
grudges are definitely a thing that Khorne could appreciate. And with
Tzeentch would appreciate the manipulation of it, wouldn't he? Like the subtlety and the contrivance of it. Yeah. I mean, that's something that does happen more in. I mean, I've discussed this with Adam, my co-host on the Fluff and Hammer, but there is a distinct difference now between the way the Chaos powers manifest in Age of Sigmar as opposed to Warhammer 40,000. So in Warhammer 40,000, they are much more abstract. The focus is on the mortal characters. So the impetus is it's Abaddon, it's Typhus, it's Ahriman, it's the specific mortal characters. In Age of Sigmar, the Chaos powers are much more characters in and of themselves, to the point whereby not only do they actively engage more in the mortal realms, but they have their own story arcs. So Nurgle is way more active with his followers in the mortal realms than he is in 40k. To the point whereby there are little stories of characters' souls turning up on the doorstep of the manse in the Garden of Nurgle, and there he is. There's Nurgle in his rocking chair on the manse, inviting them in. Slanesh is probably the best example, because Slanesh has had an actual story arc in AOS from the origins of Age of Sigmar right up to this point. At the beginning of Age of Sigmar, Slanesh was imprisoned by the Elven gods and has been basically ousted from the pantheon of the Chaos powers, but more recently has started to break free, and has now, very weirdly, given birth. It seems the way Slanesh has freed itself from this incredibly elaborate metaphysical trap that the Elven powers have woven for it is by but rebirthing itself. So now there is a shard of Slaanesh's essence somewhere in the mortal realms, swelling and growing and attracting more of its followers to itself. What that means for the metaphysics of the realms, don't know, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, but it's a bad time for the horned rat, all things considered.
I've got a funny feeling that the horned rat's going to be ousted.
Yes.
From the Pantheon. I don't think he's going to stay there for very long, because even a shard of Slaanesh is way more powerful than the Horned Rat. You know, it's just got way more legitimacy in that position than the Horned Rat does. But then again, I suppose it depends on what the other powers do as well. I mean, I know Khorne isn't very happy.
Well, no, generally anything good for the Slaanesh is not cause of celebration for Khorne.
No, very bad for Khorne. Also, I mean, I imagine the fact that Slaanesh has made Khorne look a little bit silly. One of the... Do you know how, like, Slaanesh was bound? Have you read about this?
No, I've only heard bits and pieces of the narrative. But
Well, essentially, you've got there are two realms. There's Hysh and Ulgu, and Hysh is the realm of light, and Ulgu is the realm of darkness. They're two of the mortal realms that were created from the original Winds of Magic, from the old world. And there's a state in between them called Ulgish, which is like contradiction. It's a realm of contradictions. It's both light and darkness. And the elven gods, the elven powers, lured Slaanesh there and bound it with chains that are forged of contradiction. The only way those chains can be broken is if some profoundly paradoxical thing happens in the mortal realms, and each one requires a particular kind of paradox to occur. And one of them was that it would require the input of the creature that hates Slaanesh the most to shatter it. And so Slaanesh went about this very elaborate game of baiting Khorne, basically, and just rousing his ire, to the point whereby Khorne physically got up out of his throne, strode across the realm screaming, and the sheer force of his bellow reached Slaanesh and Ulgu and shattered the chain.
If you want to bait one of the Chaos Gods, it's probably best to be Khorne, because he seems the easiest to provoke.
Well, I mean, the thing with Khorne is he wouldn't be able to resist, would he? Because it's his nature.
No.
That's his nature, and that's the thing with Slaanesh. They've subtly rewritten Slaanesh for the mortal realms recently. For example, he's not just the god of desire anymore. He's actually, what they've done is rewritten him so that he is not the god of a specific emotion like the others are. All of the others have a specific emotion at their core. So Nurgle is despair, Khorne is anger, and Tzeentch is hope. Slaanesh is empowered by degrees of emotion rather than any specific emotion. So any emotion or state taken to extremes or excess empowers Slaanesh. And what that has done is made Slaanesh's position in the Pantheon very variable. The other Chaos powers, apparently, are rather perturbed by Slaanesh, because, of course, they are all creatures of obsession themselves.
Yeah. Obsession definitely seems to be the right word. And I think that was always implied by the way that Slaaneshi forces were characterized as creatures of excess more than anything.
Yeah.
And I think it tended to focus on obsession to do with sensation and those kinds of physical hedonisms. And
that's right.
I think the shift, and that's definitely observable in 40,000 to a lesser extent, although they still haven't really unpacked Slaanesh that much in 40k, and I've
got
hope
a funny
coming.
Feeling. I've got a funny feeling that is coming. You know, it would be a waste for them not to, given the raw work they've done in Age of Sigmar with Slaanesh. I mean, the new Hedonites book is amazing. It's really good. It's such a brilliant read. I mean, they've complexified Slaanesh and his followers to the nth degree. It's fascinating. It really is. I love the psychological complexity of characters that worship gods like Slaanesh and how they fall into it. And often they do. Often they do just fall into it. It's not necessarily a matter of conscious choice or of fault. You know, they don't even realize what's happening to them until it's too late. But they need to carry that over to 40k, and I'm sure it's going to happen. I'm sure it is, given how good the Death Guard book is.
Yeah.
The new Death Guard book is something else.
I need to get that one still. I love the previous one, and
this one is amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, they've gone to town. I mean, it's so clear that this is a labour of love. It's so clear that the design team have gone, you know what, we love these guys. We absolutely love this range. We love the background. We're just going to dive deep into it. I mean, what we were talking about before, the strange utopianism of certain forces in 40k, even when on the face of it, that would seem contradictory. One thing they've gone heavily for in this new codex is how utopian the Death Guard are.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's heavily there, both in Typhus and in a very different way in Mortarion.
Yeah.
He's a failed utopian in many respects, whereas Typhus is still keeping the dream alive. But also, Nurgle, more generally, I mean, we were talking about cycles and different attitudes to take them. I mean, Nurgle is I guess, in a really depraved, strange way, to the Nietzschean question, do you accept the equation, the demonic equation of living your life exactly like this over and over again? Nurgle is enthusiastically saying yes and making of the cycles themselves something utopian.
Absolutely.
And for Nurgle, his enemies are basically anything that disrupts that, anything that tries to create stasis. I mean, of all of the gods, in many ways, has the most to complain about in terms of the Empire. I mean, you can see how Slaanesh can operate quite well within the repressions of the existing Imperium because of its, it inculcates the very thing that benefits the range of Slaanesh's powers. And with Khorne, obviously,
Khorne is obvious.
Machine. Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is a war machine, so nothing to complain about there. And Tzeentch as well. I mean, the machinations,
the politics, the machinations. Yeah, clearly.
But Nurgle has almost nothing to gain from the continued existence of the Imperium. It's merely a kind of slight on Nurgle's whole philosophy, because the Imperium is a mechanism of stasis, even when it's a mechanism of war. It is trying in its eschatological vision. Really, although it's a false vision, clearly, it's a vision that sees a linear progression to some particular point, and everything Nurgle rejects.
Everything, yeah. I mean, also the fact that the only thing I can think of that the Imperium would benefit Nurgle by is the fact that it does induce incredible despair in many of its incumbents. So that would definitely prove a breeding ground for Nurgle's aspects. But on a wider sort of metaphysical scale, that linearity is antithetical to what Nurgle represents.
And I guess he has something in common with, and this is probably the only instance you'd ever say this, with Tzeentch in that respect.
Oh, don't let him hear that.
Yes.
Don't let either of them hear that.
They're both oddly gods who like change. Tzeentch's is less bound to...
That's it, isn't it? I mean, that's the interesting thing. It's change in different ways, isn't it? So Nurgle's is very conservative.
Yeah.
Because it's the same grinding cycles over and over and over and over. It's a very particular vision of what has to be. It's the cycles of nature, isn't it?
Yes.
Ultimately. Whereas Tzeentch is about breaking that.
Yeah.
It's wild, it's crazy, it doesn't have any pattern or form.
And they both have, obviously, a lot to oppose them, an agenda that wants stasis as... I mean, the warp entity around the Emperor, who is obviously completely distinct from the Emperor himself, because it clearly has a difference. I mean, obviously, and quite interestingly, it's the warp entity created by the Imperial Creed, which is obviously created originally by a now Chaos worshipper.
By Lorgar, yeah.
And it's actually Lorgar's warp entity that is emerging in this very strange way.
If they were really clever, as and when they do, and I'm sure this is going to happen when they do the Word Bearers supplement for the Ninth Ed Chaos Space Marine Codex, as and when that occurs, they could subtly introduce that very notion. Maybe that's the long-term game.
Borg are literally worshipping this being of order that's being inculcated within the Imperium. That would be fascinating.
Wouldn't that be interesting? And the only way he can do it is by fostering the chaos powers, in opposition to it.
And that creates this whole different dynamic to the utopians like Fabius Bile, where his path is the creation of a whole new chaos god, or even actually a non-chaos god.
With Fabius Bile, it's actually what he wants is to bestill the warp.
Yeah.
So just leave it empty and stagnant.
I've always wondered if Fabius Bile has ever just thought of casting his lot wholly in with the Tyranids,
Yes.
Because their agendas have. I mean, obviously Fabius Bale has this actually quite sentimental, although he would never admit it to himself, attachment to humanity still.
Oh, he clearly does,
and that's why, that would happen. But in terms of agendas, I mean, opens up a lot of questions over what the hell the Tyranids are and whether or not anything is secretly operating them. Which is.
I mean, they are the ultimate weapon against chaos. They're the ultimate weapon because, of course, if you destroy all the conscious creatures in the universe, then chaos dies.
Yeah.
That's the way to do it.
Almost to the point where there really are only two apocalyptic endings that are possible in Warhammer 40,000. That is the total success of the Tyranids or the total success of chaos. Within the current configurations, possibly the Necrons, but they don't seem very capable of working with each other in any sustained sense. So the
Necrons have the means, but they don't have the coordination. You're right. They don't have maybe the numbers or the coordination to do it because they are separate from the warp.
Yeah, they don't fuel it in any way.
They don't have any shadow in the warp like most other living creatures do. Even the Tau do to a certain degree. It's just not very strong, it's not strong enough to... Not like humanity or the Eldari, for example. The only other entities I can think of in the 40k universe that have any hope in hell of some kind of continuation beyond it are the homunculi from the Drukhari.
I mean, in a way, even in those apocalyptic scenarios of the Tyranids or the Chaos presiding over a completely defeated universe, they could continue in their own pocket reality. There's just nothing. And they could continue to predate on a Tyranid-dominated galaxy or a Chaos-dominated galaxy.
Yeah,
exactly.
they'd probably rather enjoy that, to be honest. I mean, that's what the homunculi are some of my favourite creatures in the entirety of 40k because they have insulated themselves against everything. They are just children in a playground. The universe, all of reality, is their sadistic playground, to the point whereby even if the heat death of all of reality occurs, if everything just collapses in on itself, they can just retreat to the pocket universes they've created and that they filled with their own ecosystems and their own notions of twisted physics, and they'll be fine.
It's an identical alchemical utopianism to what we were talking about with Bloodborne. They've created a artificial world of artifice where they can focus on becoming godlike beings in and of themselves. And that's just it. That's their whole project.
Yep.
And their connection to the rest of the universe is kind of just caprice and whimsy. There's nothing else that holds them there.
They don't... I mean, that's one of the things I love about the Drukhari in particular, but in particular the homunculi, is that they have no particular horse in the race. They don't care about things like survival or territory or anything very much, other than having a bit of a good time.
Yes.
They care about whenever their forces erupt into the material universe from Comora, it's described as a carnival. It's like they're showing off their creations, and also some of them, bizarrely, they're so perverse and so insulated against consequence that they collect things like deaths They boast about the elaborate forms of death that they've suffered to their fellows. You know?
That's very aligned with like the whole Dark Elder aesthetic. I could see that. That's brilliant.
I love it. I love it so much.
I mean, there's so much you could do with those concepts, the homunculi especially. But it's interesting then that the universe becomes, if they're in any way dependent on it, they're basically dependent on it as an audience.
Yeah.
That there's a kind of, in itself, there's a sterility there, and without the universe to play off against, there would be a kind of boredom, because they can no longer really shock or surprise themselves by the various depravities and metamorphoses they're capable of any longer.
I think that's it. That's it with the homunculi. That is the only real threat that they face, to be honest. It's boredom.
Tedium, yeah.
Yeah, total boredom. Because, you know, these guys, the eldest amongst them are some of the oldest entities in the universe. They are actually the forefathers of the ancient Eldari Empire that sent it crashing into apocalypse with the creation of Slaanesh.
I love the idea that they have this relationship with, because we've brought him up before, with Fabius Bile, that they actually regard him as a sort of like gifted student who obviously could never come close to their achievements, but nonetheless is very impressive and all that.
They like him.
Yeah.
They regard him as like an apt pupil.
In this fantastically Eldari condescending way, but nonetheless, it's quite a nice feature of his character.
It is amusing, and I like the fact that Fabius is sane enough amongst not just the Chaos characters, but the Space Marines in general, that he doesn't really acknowledge the xenophobia that's sort of ingrained in them, you know? He doesn't care very much. If an alien race can provide something of use, then fine.
Yeah, he is a absolutely ruthless pragmatist. There's not actually a lot of vanity in him. There's actually more sentimentality in Fabius Bile than there is vanity, which you wouldn't expect from the
it becomes apparent.
Analysis. Yeah,
it becomes apparent when you read the novels by Josh Reynolds, and certainly in the last one, there is a sentimentality, a bizarre sentimentality to him, whereby at the end of that particular book, he actually does some very oddly selfless things for his followers who he likes. You know, it's unusual, it's very strange, but it does happen. The same is true of Ahriman.
Yeah. Arguably less true of the Chaos Undivided leader. I forget the name.
Oh, Abaddon.
Abaddon. I think
there's a or Abby Dabby Doodardon, as we like to call him.
Has no sentimentality. A utopian project still. Although, maybe not even that, because it's a very ego-driven project for Abaddon, I get the feel. Like, there's a sense that he won't be brought down by the Chaos Gods. It's not so much that some vestige of humanity won't be.
It's almost like he's trying to prove himself against Horus. He regards Horus as being weak and as being the dupe of the Chaos powers. He believes that Horus allowed himself to become the puppet of gods in a way that he won't.
Which is,
if anything, the gods are going to fight over him.
Yeah, I mean, they've done that with Archeon in the Warhammer, the Age of Sigmar world as well.
Very much.
Yeah.
I mean, they've emphasised that hugely with the more recent Slaves to Darkness release. Archeon is actually now a very different character. What they've drawn is that he doesn't like gods at all. He's actually trying to facilitate a state where the gods die, where there is it's a godless universe, essentially. And that includes the Chaos powers. And they are actually kind of afraid of him in many respects, because he has the power and the authority and the will to do it.
I mean, the hilarious thing about that is his project is, although aesthetically quite different, functionally identical to the Emperor's original project in that sense.
In many respects, yeah, there is overlap there. There is a lot of overlap. I mean, one of my favourite bits of writing in one of the more recent books is when Archaon actually finds Slaanesh in Ulgish, and is trying to free the Chaos Power for his own ends, obviously. And Slaanesh is speaking to him. Slaanesh is talking to him as he would to a sort of returned lover. And Archaon's response is like, "Oh, shut up." He basically says to him, "If you don't shut up, I'm going to leave you here."
That's fantastic. That's probably the first time that's ever happened to Slaanesh, I would imagine.
Yeah, well, Slaanesh loves it. Know, Slaanesh can't help but love that kind of thing. What I love about Slaanesh is that nothing can displease him.
Yeah.
Nothing can. Even his own imprisonment, which you'd think would be a problem, actually he regards in this very ambiguous way. When he's originally imprisoned, there is this kind of scream of rage that then becomes a shock of pleasure because it's new. And it's interesting, and it's never happened before. I loved that so much.
I was just recently revisiting the first of the Hellraiser films, and with Slaanesh, also, obviously, with the homunculi,
the influence is clear. They're Cenobites in space.
Yeah.
They are absolutely Cenobites in space.
Yeah. And that's a dominant theme of Barker's metaphysics, obviously, that idea of, again, it's not hedonism in the simplistic sense, it's that capacity to enjoy and relish all experiences.
It's something that really I wish the latter films would explore, but they generally don't. They go for pretty much simplistic 1980s horror movie schlock after that one. But the first two films certainly really do emphasize this notion that the Cenobites are ambiguous. They're not monsters.
They exist outside of moral configurations entirely. They're not moral creatures, but they're not evil creatures either. They just don't factor those kinds of things into their schemes whatsoever.
Well, it's like the whole dynamic between them and Frank Cotton. So Frank summons them thinking, just blithely assuming, that his notions of pleasure tally with theirs. Which is a grand mistake. Obviously, their concepts of what is pleasurable is so far beyond what anything Frank can preconceive that there is no distinction between pleasure and pain. There is no distinction between transcendence and disgrace. And there's something really beautiful and attractive about that. I mean, that for me is the core of the Hellraiser mythology. It's why it's so interesting. Even if people don't realise that is what they're responding to, it's that notion of, if I had the box, would I? I don't know, you know?
It's interesting that Frank never himself transcends. He just...
Right.
And I think there's a commentary there, which again I think it's a Barkerian theme about ego, because I think if there's anything Barker detests, it's this kind of insular, inward-looking, vain egotism that denies experience, that denies the possibility of transcendence. And Frank is that because he is so selfishly obsessed with his own petty schemes, and he's just incapable of embracing because of course all the Cenobites literally started like him as just people who messed with these forces, and some of them, it's implied, I think in the second or third film, they embrace it pretty quickly. I mean, the third film is obviously different metaphysically because they've got all kinds of other stuff going on by that point. But nonetheless, there's that sense that there's this potential to transcend almost immediately.
Yeah, I mean, Channard from the second film, Dr. Channard, ably played by Ken Cranham, he transcends pretty much immediately. He is the perfect soul for the Cenobites, you know?
Yeah.
And in fact, he has the line that I think encapsulates the philosophy of the Cenobites so perfectly. It's for me the best line in the entire franchise. When he is introduced into Cenobitism, he emerges from the great chamber that turns him into a Cenobite, and he opens his eyes and he goes, "To think I hesitated." And I'm like, oh yeah, for me I love it. I love it so much because, like, yes, yes, I mean, he's experienced a kind of transcendence.
Yeah, yeah. And also within the scope of a universe where there aren't necessarily very many other options. Again, in the sort of, I mean, we're emphasizing that with the Warhammer 40,000, like the alternative, of course, to either one of the utopian schemes of the likes of Fabius Bile or becoming a demon prince is just to become food for the gods. That's the only other option. And yeah.
I mean, what I like about the Hellraiser universe is there's not even a suggestion that there's any other metaphysics. This may be it.
I think that's heavily implied. Like there is a sense that like there's potentially other things, but nothing is ever suggested, not directly. And whatever this is seems to itself be an artifice. Like it all happens through human constructions, puzzle boxes, and it happens in very human terms. So it doesn't look like it's something that comes from outside of humanity inherently, even if it
No, I mean, from what I understand, even in the second film, you have the notion of the god of the Cenobites, the Leviathan, which is this gigantic equivalent of the puzzle box that turns at the center of this very non-Abrahamic hell. There is even, I'm sure I remember reading somewhere that Barker was going to delve into the origins of Leviathan, and even Leviathan, the god of the Cenobites, was going to have been a human being at one point.
I mean, I think that would make a lot of sense, or that the god of this is actually itself an artifice of humanity in some way. Like, again, the alchemical aspects, and this hell, I only dimly remember the second film because I think I've seen it twice and both times quite a long time ago. But the idea of this hell as a kind of another Bloodborne hell, another sort of opt-out pocket universe.
That's pretty much it.
Yeah.
It's its own strange place. I mean, what I love about the way it's presented, there's no explanation for it at all. There's no explanation of what it is. But when it's summoned, when the box is opened and the ways into this strange labyrinth occur, it's like it interweaves with physical reality. So you'll get pockets and areas that are drawn in from our world in that place. And it's also a psychoscape, so it remolds itself according to whoever's there. And innocence is no defense against it. It doesn't make any moral judgments, really. So, characters that are ostensibly innocent, like Larry from the first film, who doesn't really do anything terribly wrong other than being a very, very boring husband, which I'm sure Barker would think is sin enough. But he ends up there. He's there, definitely. Julia, obviously, but, I love Julia so much, and I love Claire Higgins. I think she's great.
Oh, she does that part so well. There's a kind of... there's a sort of restraint to it that you wouldn't expect from a character like that. Like there's a way of doing that character that would be considerably more playing into the role in a sort of like stereotypical way, in a sort of like predictable way. Yeah,
sort of like a 1980s horror villain, like Freddy Krueger, sort of. But she doesn't. I love the way the film, like when she commits her first murder for Frank, for example, it's this incredible moment of trauma for her. It's horrific.
No relish. There's no relish at all, and in fact, there's not even that much relish in her later murders. She just gets more accustomed to it.
Yeah. But I do love the fact that the way the film frames her, as she goes on, she becomes more statuesque and she becomes more beautiful, and the hair gets bigger and she becomes more like Bride of Frankenstein. Yeah. I just love that stuff. I love the way she kind of transcends as well. And of course, in the second film, she is something else entirely. I mean, she's an agent of hell. She has some of the most amazing lines in that film. When she re-encounters Kirsty after she's been resurrected, she has the line, they've changed the rules of the fairy tale. I'm no longer the wicked stepmother. Now I'm the evil queen. And it's like, oh, God, Claire, I bet you read that in the script and you were just like, yes, I'm having that role. I'm having that role.
I mean, interestingly, where Frank can't transcend, she is
does.
somebody who does. Yeah,
she does. Yeah, she is. We one of the first recordings I ever did with Kit Power, we did a commentary for Hellraiser 2. We watched it through and we did like a commentary for it. And one of the things we discussed was the fact that Julia is just such a more interesting character than Frank.
Well, it's interesting. In the first film, it's almost as if a lot of the time Frank's role is to be something that she projects herself onto.
Right.
Like he isn't that interesting even in the first film. He's a sort of lecherous, selfish, very very slavish to his own desires, but in a very like dull way kind of person. And she builds him up in her mind, mostly out of the boredom and tedium of being with
with Larry.
Yeah.
She doesn't have much basis for comparison, does she?
No.
That's the problem.
Definitely, her tragedy is definitely being sort of surrounded by mediocrity.
But by mediocre men, yeah. Poor Julia. But she comes out of it, I'm telling you, she comes out of it very, very well. She's very powerful when she comes back from hell. And you're right, she is so much more complex because she does experience that transcendence where she buys into it, whereas Frank doesn't.
I mean, because her main thing is that she is capable of showing that devotion to something, and she can show it to the world that the Cenobites provide her just as readily as she can show it to Frank. And of course, Frank ends up in the second one like this miserable, pathetic victim of his own, really just like the most stereotypical male desires imaginable, just endlessly played out but constantly denied to him.
That's pretty much it.
Almost being punished by the paucity of his imagination, which is a very very in line with the with that kind of universe. It's quite...
you create your own hell in that universe. That's definitely the case. I mean, I think the Cenobites point that out actually when they first encounter Kirsty, because Kirsty obviously goes into hell to try and find Larry. She wants to save him, to bring him out, but Pinhead points out to her that it's impossible. He's in his own hell and you are in yours. So, sorry.
In an amusing way, it's kind of like a perverse version of the universal sort of salvation of C.S. Lewis, where he has that exact concept where we all go to the same afterlife, but our attitudes shape our ability to interact with it. Only I don't think C.S. Lewis would quite as much enjoy the marriage of heaven and hell theme Barker employs.
I mean, I would pay good money to have C.S. Lewis sit down and watch Hellraiser. I really would.
Would be an amusing sport, yeah, definitely.
I think he'd be quite appalled.
I think it probably wouldn't be that interesting because he would just be stereotypically English in his responses to something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a certain irony, isn't it? Again, this is something I discussed with Kit Power when we did Weave World, but there is an obvious and overt influence of Lewis on Barker's work. And Barker himself has said this, a lot of his fiction is so clearly influenced by Lewis. You have that very particular notion in British fantasy of a magical artifact that allows you to step into another world, or that allows another world to erupt into this one, and that occurs in Barker all the time. And it's fascinating to me that a tradition like that's dominated by figures like Lewis has given rise to someone like Barker, who is the inversion of it all.
I mean, we have this wonderful folkloric tradition of portals in that way, and I think that's something that Lewis taps into. I mean, for all of his faults, the concept of the wardrobe and his general use of portals in those stories, which is actually one of the most pagan aspects of his otherwise quite overly Christian allegories. It's really interesting, and I think that's actually, and he'd probably not be happy about this, but that's probably the thing that survived him in terms of its influence on other writers.
I think so. I think that's absolutely true, and it is. You're absolutely right. One of the things I did point out when I reread The Magician's Nephew for my retrospectives of the Chronicles of Narnia is that one of the areas where he is just a past master, where it's absolutely beautiful, is his use of transitional mechanisms, like magical mechanisms to go to other worlds. So in The Magician's Nephew, you have the initial mechanism of these magic rings that allow the children to go not to Narnia, but to this in between, this liminal space that's in between realities, and it's like a wood, and around the roots of the trees there are pools of water, and each one of those pools leads to a different universe. It's kind of wonderful.
Yeah, and again, like, weirdly not Christian. Like,
weirdly not. I mean, and it happens all the way through. Every single one of the books has a different mechanism for the terrestrial children going to Narnia. So you've got the wardrobe is probably the most iconic. It's a wonderful concept. It really is wonderful, isn't it? It's so innocuous, but it's something that children can actually play at. They can actually project their own imagination into it, you know? And the way it's framed in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is stunning. It really is gorgeous. The way you've got the children start to realise that the wardrobe's a bit bigger than they thought it was, and as they're pushing through the coats, there's the smell of mothballs melding into the smell of pine needles and of frost and of snow, and then they emerge into the lantern wastes with that wonderful, wonderful concept of the lamppost in the middle of the woods. It's beautiful. It really is. I mean, it's part of my massive ambiguity with these books.
Yeah. I mean, there is ambiguity there. I think there's a temptation in a sort of more Pullman line to dismiss Lewis almost entirely. And there's good reason for that. I mean, there's tons of good reasons for that.
There's a lot of good reason for that. Most of it in The Horse and His Boy.
Yes. I mean, I think the less that could be said on his views on race, the better generally. Wow. There's not much to be gained from almost any commentary on what he has to say about that and civilizational conflict.
I think the best expression of it comes from the fact that in the 1980s, which was not an era that well known for its progressive racial politics, even in the 1980s, the BBC wouldn't produce an adaptation of The Horse and His Boy.
I mean, it has nothing to say. That book just doesn't add anything to... It doesn't even add much in the way of plot to that world. It's just Lewis going on a rant. And
it really is, isn't it?
So way back in the day, in the sort of noughties YouTube thing, I jousted often with this... Catholic guy. I was sort of really into Max Stirner back then, which is
right.
Probably not a hell of a lot better, but whatever. A weird thing. And he, for some reason, despite being Catholic, was very into Lewis at that point. He did that standard thing in the atheist versus theist wars, which I think we both avoided in that. So
thankfully, thank God, eh? Can you imagine?
Oh, it was just so tedious. I kind of got like a reputation as being one of the atheist channels for a very short period, and I'm not sure why. Like, I was on record of being an atheist. I made no videos about theology or arguments against God or any of that tedious stuff. But
drawn into the hinterlands of it.
But he really wanted to make a thing of like us having a debate. I was younger, and he challenged me to read a book, and I could get him to read a book, and I thought it would be very amusing if I got him to read Max Stirner. So I told him to read The Ego in Its Own, which is quite cruel, although he never did. And I read Mere Christianity, which is a roundabout way of explaining how I would ever come to read Mere Christianity. And, I mean, C.S. Lewis at his most ranty, and is like, where he's doing non-fiction and he's just going all out. I mean, that.
His books on theology are terrible.
Yeah,
I mean, even were I, theologically inclined, In fact, if I were theologically inclined, if I were a believer of some description or some kind of subscriber of some kind of like Christian philosophy, I'd be insulted by those books. I'd probably be angrier about it because the arguments are so bad.
They're really vapid. I mean, I can see actually why sort of a YouTube debater would enjoy them, because they do that thing, and you see this in any ideological sphere, really. I mean, you see it on the left all the time,
Yeah.
where you adopt every position that kind of aligns with your side, even if they're mutually incompatible, and then just throw them against your enemies to see what works. So, you have these people who will they will cite Augustine and Kierkegaard in the same sentence, as those two theological thinkers aren't diametrically opposed on a whole range of important philosophical points. They will make Wittgensteinian reasons for believing in God, and then Platonic ones. Like, it's just and yeah, I mean, as I say, you do see that on the left too.
You do, yeah, and you certainly see it from like the atheist circles on YouTube. Definitely, you do.
Time. I mean, those people. I mean, like, for them, it's often just a sport, so there isn't really even like, there's no real passionate belief there. They generally have some notion of liberal freedom that motivates them, and a feeling that some old woman going to church every Sunday is somehow a threat to that liberal freedom, which is questionable. But yeah, that's about it. Otherwise, it's just the owning people in debate. I think I did a thing on Twitter recently about how the whole notion of debate has been sort of debased by these internet conceptions of it, that nobody could describe in real terms what's going on. Especially when I see things coming out of Twitch. I mean, like, and it has really perverse consequences. I mean, a really good example recently is how a whole bunch of quote-unquote trans allies, but I'm being very generous, on Twitch decided that they were going to adopt increasingly trans-med-esque arguments, which is to say medicalized gatekeeping of trans people, because those were the arguments that they'd gotten used to using in the debate circuits with trans folks, because those are easy arguments to win quick, very rhetorically satisfactory debates. So the needs of rhetoric eventually, even amongst these people who consider themselves allies, inevitably, I feel, overtake even actually being aligned with the group that they're allegedly defending.
Right, or with the requirements of that group, or with any genuine situations that group finds themselves in. Yeah, that is definitely something that happens quite a lot. I mean, there are certain creators who tackle that very phenomenon, of course. I mean, if you look at the horror films of Jordan Peele, he kind of tackles that from a racial perspective. So it's often... he's often critiquing the far more subtle forms of racism, entrenched racism, that you find in liberal circles, for example.
I find it fascinating how many liberals, especially with Get Out, will just flatly misread that film.
It was so much fun.
See the villains in it as sort of Trumpian caricatures when they're obviously not that. Not that God Peele has any time for the Trumpians, of course, but that film is not aimed that way, and
it so isn't. It's quite wonderful. The discomfort factor, and I adored.
I mean, that's always the thing with these satires, because the people who are entrenched in these ideologies are so incapable of even reading the critiques of themselves, because they have a perceptual block to it. I mean, I think this is universally the case with these kinds of subtler allegorical satires in this way. I mean, you can see, misreadings of things like the Stepford Wives, for example, similar lines. Anything that is actually not aimed at the most grotesque examples of the of the bigotry in question,
Mm-hmm.
but the more subtler, more integrated, more, humming and hawing version of it.
More recently, you had the Joker film, obviously, and you had lots of people on the right adopting the image of that character, despite the fact that the film is clearly, it's so overtly, I certainly in the way that I read it, a critique of right-wing structures, systems, and assumptions.
Absolutely. I can't remember who, but there's a Trotskyist commentator. He wrote a book on the internet a while ago. I'll probably not remember his name, but he wrote a Guardian article saying that if he had any criticism of the film, it was almost so propagandistically anti-neoliberalism that it was
Right.
like put like a sort of like socialist realist, Russian kind of like commissar type figure like to shame. Like they would be like this is too much, obviously
Right.
we hate the American capitalists, but this is just caricature. I mean, like everything in that world was about the dilapidation of social systems, the abandonment of the mentally ill, the various ways in which different oppressed groups and communities were especially vulnerable. And then to read that film as some kind of sort of dude bro endorsement of,
Right.
yeah.
I don't know how it happens, but it has.
But
It actually has. And, to the point whereby there are lots of commentators. Actually, one of the things I found about the film, certainly before it came out, was a lot of the preemptive criticisms of it that came from ostensibly left-wing sources I found to be in such bad faith.
yeah, I mean, a lot of that stuff. I think there is, because of the terms of the culture war and everything being obviously incredibly heated in the way that attacks come, and then the comments that the director made that
Of
played obviously
course.
directly into the right of the culture war. There was an understandable fear. I mean, also like the other films that he's made, like
Right. The Hangover films, yeah, just
I did actually
appalling.
tell Kit at one point I would revisit them in an effort to sort of like chart the emergence of some of the ideas in the Joker, because I actually had this idea that as bad as those films are, and I absolutely agreed that they are terrible movies, especially in the third one, there are intimations of some of the themes never
Right.
done even vaguely on the same level, and often handled terribly.
But there's even like intimations of the humor. So the director often whinges and whines about how what he describes as woke culture has killed comedy. What actually has killed his comedies is the fact that they aren't funny and they're mean and they're cruel. They're kicking down, they're bullying, victimization. But that humor translated into the framing of the Joker actually works.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the Joker, as a bad comedian, explicitly trades off how unfunny that moral universe is, and that's where a lot of the pathos of the film comes from.
Well, this is something Kit pointed out when we talked about specifically about the Joker. You have the character of Arthur Fleck counterposed to characters like Murray, the character who is fantastic, wealthy, successful comedian whom he idolizes, and yet Murray's jokes are trash.
Yeah.
He's not a funny guy at all. He's no more or less funny than Fleck is.
They do up the sense of the framing of these different people. So what Murray has that Arthur doesn't is this entire apparatus that's framing him as funny.
Right.
And there's, again, like it's kind of a very on the nose ideological commentary, and the film in this way, it does also have continuity with the Hangover movies. It isn't a subtle movie. Very rarely is it nuanced, although even then still wildly misinterpreted. So I guess there's stuff to be said about how you could actually convey these ideas in any sensible way. But yeah, like it's the framing. Murray is already established as a comedian, and so he can tell incredibly unfunny jokes, and people are cued.
In a way, there's a sort of ideological crossover there with Heath Ledger's Joker. When he says that it's all part of the plan. That's exactly it.
Yeah,
That's exactly it. But whereas Heath Ledger's Joker is commenting on systemic violence versus his own more personal violence, here it's humour.
yeah. There's a old film by that almost never comes up, by Charlie Chaplin, where Chaplin plays a serial murderer. And the whole thing is a setup for the court case where he makes this exact defense of all of his actions and brings up all of the various forms of institutionalized violences that contextualize his actions. And of course, the film is quite explicit that this is the ideological self-justification of a maniac. But at the same time, it's clearly also a fantastic opportunity for Charlie Chaplin just to get up and rip apart, what he considers to be the caprices of society in his age and the hypocrisies. And for some reason, the Heath Ledger's Joker is really very much that. He's actually trying to prove his misanthropy in those films.
Right. I mean, I think it's Jack Graham described him as, he's a man who markets himself as being like the purist anarchist, but actually what he is a kind of reactionary conservative.
Absolutely, yes. He's just a misanthrope, and that is the ultimate ideology of reactionaries. I mean, there's a reason why, from sort of M.L. Chorin, Nick Land, Schopenhauer, you do have a long line of deeply pessimistic right-wing thought. That's, misery is actually at the core, I believe, of conservatism.
And, I mean, a sort of a lack of willingness or ability to imagine tomorrow.
I mean, there's I can't remember his name. He's a bad Wagner scholar. Richard Scruton, I think it is. But he's actually given whole defences, if I'm getting the right name. I might be slandering a conservative, which isn't the worst thing you can do.
No, I was going to say that's not a terrible thing, really.
I mean, they dishonour themselves. So
right. There's, I'm sure there's probably something terrible, so it's fine.
But whoever it was, and I suspect it was him, he wrote an entire defence of conservatism as grounded pessimism, which I think is a wonderful sort of telling on themselves sort of moment. Because it is the ultimate ideology of conservatism. It is always grounded in, well, I mean, you see it most visibly in their arguments that appeal to human nature against the left. And, there's a lot that can and can't be said about that. And there's also a lot that's obviously projected onto different left-wing thought about what they actually say about human nature, which is often not the case. But beyond that, just to focus and zero in on the incredibly debased conception of what human nature is to them as these very material but selfish, but material and selfish in a way that has no enjoyment. There's no we're driven to status and hoarding, but not even out of any pleasure of the things that we hoard or the capabilities that our status gives us. It's just this human drive that exists.
Right, it's almost mindless, It's almost like they market it as though it's almost like a genetic imperative.
And there's actually very little pleasure in it. And the only way to counteract it is to impose these very harsh social rules that they kind of acknowledge lead to misery as well. But are just necessary, because otherwise, and obviously this also tells a lot about the, without these impositions, we would just go around being monsters to each other all the time, which does make you wonder what goes on in their minds.
It's very much analogous to what often came up in the sort of atheist-theist debates, when you have people who argue that humanity can't be moral without God. The core assumption of that is that humanity is innately base and rapine and murderous and selfish. And you have to ask yourself, don't you? Well, what is keeping you from doing that then?
Yeah.
What kind of life do you actually have?
And in like the most sort of trivializing and nonsense depictions of gods, it is literally having an eternal father figure.
Right.
It's you know, I
It's
mean,
that invisible authoritarian that's
yeah,
always looking over you and keeping you from doing terrible things. Because, I mean, my counterpoint to that is, well, actually, I do rape and murder all I want, which is
yeah,
none.
yes, exactly.
Which is none.
Yeah, and like there's obviously problems with the Freudian conception because I think there it's about integrating that authority in yourself rather than finding ways of being in the world freed from it. But
Right.
but I think the Freudian view is kind of elucidating here because there's a kind of sense in which that conception of God, which I'm at pains to say is obviously not all conceptions of God. There are various more liberatory, more
Of
interesting
course.
views about what the divine could mean to people.
More
But that,
transcendent,
yeah,
more progressive, enlightened. Blake. I always go back to Blake.
absolutely. And the whole relationship with a god like that is it's obviously not my relationship to the universe, but it's a fascinating one. But this father god, it's just a outright refusal to grow up on the most on the most like debased psychoanalytic level. And Freud definitely perceived in those terms as something of an atheist himself.
Right, it's almost
Um,
internalizing a father figure, isn't it? It's
well,
creating one in your own mind.
well, for Freud, like doing that would be growing up, which is where I'd slightly disagree with him. But he would say that they are refusing even to do that. That they have to pretend that the father literally exists over them
Yes.
in order to avoid even integrating it, so that they can be autonomous individuals.
Right,
And I
which
think,
is a contradiction in and of itself, isn't it? It's
yeah,
so bizarre.
yeah. I mean, it's fascinating, and I think that the psychology of conservatism is very interesting because I think the psychology of all political ideologies can be interesting, and there's certainly lots of things that go on in the left, and of course, conservatism broadly defined can penetrate the left in all kinds of ways. But the psychology of conservatism is so fantastically unreflective, and
Right.
it has this like surface obviousness to it that is just astonishing. Like, it's hard to believe that they don't realize this about themselves when they're writing books about how miserable the universe is and how that's the basis of a political philosophy. So it's amazing that they can't take any step back and actually reflect that there is something deeply poisonous about their fundamental relationship.
It's amazing. It's so amazing, and that you become incredulous, don't you? I find myself becoming incredulous a lot of the time. That it's almost I find myself falling into that trap of wondering if this is sincere,
yeah,
or not. Which sometimes it is, but often it isn't.
I mean, I think, there's a whole other thing that can be said about the phenomenon of grifting, and I think obviously that happens across the political spectrum.
Of course it does. Of course it does. I mean, it's endemic on the right, though.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's
endemic.
Yeah.
I can't even think of a right-wing commentator who is sincere, or at least, if not sincere, then consistent. You know?
Yeah, it's.
I mean, we had the marvelous example of Peter Hitchens recently, railing against the significance of COVID and whatnot, but making sure that he's got his COVID jab as soon as possible.
He's an odd guy because he seems to be situating himself very much as a J.K. Chesterton figure. And he really isn't Chesterton.
He doesn't have the charm, he doesn't have the eloquence, and he doesn't have the intelligence.
He doesn't have the self-awareness. I think that's more fundamental. Like Chesterton realized his own foibles and limits. I mean, and I'm not trying to launch an impassioned defense of Chesterton, I'm sure.
No, not at all. I mean, but compared and contrasted.
Yeah. I mean, Chesterton has had this fantastic ability to be slyly generous to his adversaries, and even to actually enjoy the relationship he had with people he disagreed with.
There was a certain badinage, wasn't there?
Yeah.
There's a certain joyousness, but Peter Hitchens is a man for whom it seems even basic pleasure in life, in existence, is anathema.
He doesn't seem to take much joy in things. I mean, he definitely is
Well, he seems to be counterposed to the very notion of joy.
Yeah, yeah. I think
in a very British way.
I think he'd outright say that, in a sense. I think he would say something like, "Oh, life isn't meant for enjoyment. Life is meant for greater things, and if you're enjoying it, you're not accomplishing those things."
Yeah, but what are those greater things?
Well, exactly.
That's what I can't. That what greater things?
Yeah.
What has he done? What has he actually achieved in humanity? Because it seems to me there is nothing. There's a kind of vacuum there.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's no real project, because he's a pessimist, and he's a weird kind of pessimist, because Christian pessimism is an inherently self-contradictory thing in and of itself.
I was going to say, I don't understand that at all.
I mean, I knew someone once who turned out to be a bit of a reactionary himself, but he did say this, and I think it was broadly right, that there's something very insincere about Christian pessimism for how common it is. You know, there's something slightly winking about it. There's something slightly...
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. I mean, it's something that, funnily enough, Terry Pratchett points out in one of his books. There is I believe it's in the book Carp Jugulum, there's a great commentary from one of the witch characters, Granny Weatherwax, where she's talking to what is essentially an evangelist. It's the Discworld equivalent of an evangelist. And she says to him, "You know what, if I genuinely believed what you proclaim to, if I thought there was a God that was worth a damn, that cared eternally about its adherents and was omnibenevolent, then you wouldn't catch me round here waving pamphlets around and pissing and moaning about it. No one would ever hear from me again. You'd find me up a mountain somewhere trying to commune with it."
Absolutely. And you actually see that, I think, maybe not in extremists, but I think there's something more inherently trustworthy in a humanist Christian optimism, or any kind of monotheistic optimism. And when you think of the great joyousness of somebody like Rumi, a great mystic, or Blake, for that matter.
Blake, the joyousness of Blake in God.
Yeah.
Is unfathomable. I mean, it's ecstatic. It's a transcendental experience that Blake has, and it's a sensual one as well.
And
Blake is that wonderful metaphysician, very like Barker, who I'm sure is a reincarnation of him at this point, who commingles the earthly, the base, and the sensual with the transcendental and the metaphysical. So in Blake's purview, things like sex and food and passion are not separate from the visionary and the spiritual. They're part of it.
Yeah. He's a Gnostic without any of the sort of like anti-cosmic maya of that. And I mean, Gnosticism that is even anti-cosmic, that is even anti the material world, is still strangely optimistic, because of course there's an inherent built-in capacity for transcendence.
Of course.
But Blake doesn't even go with that kind of... he's more like a Neoplatonist in that way. He actually sees the world as having some falsities to it, but it's still a reflection of the truth. And that's, I think, really like shoots through all of his poetry, that kind of sense of just being in love with everything, just everything, embracing it all.
Yeah. There's no distinction with Blake from what would generally be considered mundane experience or transcendental grand experience. It's all beautiful. And it's all grist to the mill.
And a properly eschatological worldview that actually really stressed the linearity. I mean, again, going back to our earlier discussions of that sort of cyclicality and the problems with it, and the way that it has this nightmarish quality, really.
The way it kind of traps you in certain sets of assumptions that cannot be escaped from.
and whatever you think of eschatology and how plausible it is, it completely obviates that. It's a fundamentally, I wouldn't quite say utopian, because it's otherworldly, and I think utopianism shouldn't be, but it has that sense of rich possibilities, and that we're not doomed, and actually fundamentally we can't be doomed.
Right.
Is at least not universally, and in some instances for more universalist believers, none of us are. And I think, like, if you genuinely believe that, without perhaps the elements of salvation anxiety, which is, I think, where you find a certain vein of more plausible Christian pessimism, certainly in the more Calvinist strains. I mean, I think you could talk about that in relation to Gothic literature a lot. But that is an optimistic worldview, and there is something very odd about Christians like Hitchens, who are so dour.
I find, I get the impression with him that it's a very befuddled and British thing. It's like when people put Church of England on their birth certificate because that's what their parents were. It doesn't actually mean anything. What it actually becomes in the hands of someone like Hitchens is a cudgel. It just becomes a weapon by which that they can browbeat others, or a platform upon which they can elevate themselves in a very base and mundane way. There's actually no metaphysics involved. I get the impression that, like, were someone like Hitchens to encounter one of Blake's angels, there'd be no celebration. There'd be no awe. There would be horror,
Yes. Well, that would be a challenge, I think, to the fundamentals of his worldview. Like, I don't think he would welcome that. It would, if he was at all intellectually honest, which recent events do bring into question.
I don't think he is.
I suspect not. But I mean, at a certain level, I suspect these people can't be anymore. I was very amused that I don't know if you saw that. He quote tweeted our
Jack. He didn't like that, did he? Oh, he didn't like that. He got very angry, didn't he?
Yeah, in a very petulant way. But I mean, this is a guy who occasionally tweets his own name because he obviously doesn't tell the difference between the search function and the tweet function. So, perhaps people over a certain age are to be gently reminded that this is not great space for them, especially if they can't make a go of it. Like he's not good at being very online, but nonetheless he is.
What I find amazing though is the amount of people who don't seem to be able to see that he wants to have his cake and eat it. So he wants to be able to market himself as being this sort of anti-establishment paragon of what he would call freedom and free speech and whatnot, but it's in total contradiction to what he actually does and what he's espoused with regards to other demographics and other groups and whatnot. It's a total fantasy, and that they are being grifted again. It's amazing to me that people can't see it.
They can always delineate the notion of freedom sufficient that it, like, helps them to shut off those possibilities and those contradictions, and that's how they do it. And the notion of the establishment on the right is intensely fascinating, because, I mean, of course, the notion of the establishment on the left, even sides of the left that I wouldn't subscribe to, it tends to be a multifaceted thing. Like, very few on the left believe that there is a singular monolithic establishment with its own coherent goals. And believing that allows people on the right to say things like, oh, well, this company came out against racism and said that they're for BLM. So clearly that's a part of the establishment.
Right.
This government did this and that government did that. And everything can feed into a singular monolithic establishment of their own devising. Whereas, on the left, we talk about, I mean, for example, on the Marxist left, it's very common to talk about phenomenon like Brexit as a war within the establishment, a war between different nationalist visions, between different forces of capital that have slightly different, even if overlapping in some respects, interests. And you know this, and like, for example, that ardent Brexiters, they're more likely to come from aristocratic and landowning backgrounds, whereas ardent capitalist Remainers are more likely to come from the, either nouveau riche or the traditional bourgeoisie, and
Right.
the people who depend on the existing configuration. And
So there is an acknowledgement of complexity,
yeah,
an inherent acknowledgement of complexity, which is both a strength and a weakness, of course, because what the strength of the right in that regard is that their rhetoric is punchy and simple, and it refers to ideas and concepts that are so sort of like crayon drawn in their simplicity that people get them and respond to them in a very visceral way. Whereas on the left, we very often have to dissemble, we have to break down and acknowledge that actually there are not simple answers for very complex problems.
One of the most profound sophistical tricks, and you find it all the time amongst journalists, is to treat any answer that isn't a yes or no as inherently suspicious.
Right.
And, I mean, you'll see it often, and it's hard not to fall into the trap of really enjoying that when it's done to one of your enemies, because when people are, the idea that if you're explaining, you've already lost, and in rhetorical terms, sadly, that is often the case. And when you see it done to somebody you don't like, it's easy to relish that.
There's a sort of gotcha feeling, isn't there?
But of course, in anything as complicated as politics, philosophy, anything at the level of abstraction, it's almost always an untruth to give a yes or no answer.
Right. There are going to be ambiguities and exceptions. That's just the nature of being.
Yeah. And obviously, within that, you can talk about the various obfuscations you can use the various ways in which they can talk around issues, etc., etc. But the denial of complexity and the suspicion of complexity, and I think especially in a highly anti-intellectual culture like Britain's,
yes,
which is deeply suspicious of anything that isn't sometimes monosyllabic. Maybe I'm being unfair to compatriots, but it can feel like that. If you've, having just come out as non-binary, one of the first things that sort of confronts non-binary people is the apparent nonsense of an identity based in complexity. And, like one of the most common tropes utilized is, the Facebook thing of like, I don't know, 800, 10,000, whatever it was, different genders on that list that they had, which they don't anymore. You can just put in whatever you want, gay Facebook. But yeah, like just the idea that the explorations of the nuances and complexities of something is deeply suspicious is I think very baked into the British mind in terms of how we've been trained by our education systems.
It dovetails with certain cultural assumptions, doesn't it, that we always use as like rhetorical devices, like the notion of common sense, which is one of the most absurd, empty notions. What I love about the notion of common sense in particular is how obviously contradictory it is. It's only ever invoked, and it is only ever invoked to demonstrate the lack of it.
Yes, yeah. It's a strictly negative concept, yeah. It
and
has
therefore,
no content. Yeah.
Is contradictory.
Yeah. There's no. And I mean, there's a fantastic essay by E.M. Foster called "Notes on the English Character." I think it is. I might be wrong by one word or something, but and he talks brilliantly about the English capacity to muddle, and has this thing that it's not a lack of feeling that's trained into it, and he sees this all as emanating from the public school system, but ultimately tracing that back to class. And I mean, I'm not really quite sure what his own political views were, but it's a very Marxist compatible reading of why English culture is reactionary in the ways that it is, and I think worth reviving in that spirit. And he has this whole thing that we're not trained into unfeelingness. We're trained into a capacity to muddle ourselves. And he has
Yeah.
an example from the beginning of Sense and Sensibility, I believe it is, where a character is talking with his wife about an inheritance, and he's being put in charge of it, but was asked to give a certain proportion to a woman, I think his sister. It was either a mother or sibling of somebody of theirs that died, and he was basically duty bound to protect her interests. But
Right.
he was completely at liberty to do what he wants within the law.
Hmm.
And it's not that he just went, I'm just going to be evil. I'm just going to take all the money for myself and my family, but that he, through a discussion with his wife, who sort of gradually unveiled upon him, oh, you know, our children, our friends, our
Hmm.
obligations, and oh, her circumstances being different, her needs being different, and it didn't even all shift at once, but slowly chipped away until eventually
Right.
he was offering her almost, this person that he was duty bound to watch out for, he was giving her almost nothing. But at no
Right.
stage was there any callousness or malice in it. It was just a capacity to endlessly self-delude that path
Yes.
was the right and I used this in an essay which I called, obviously off the essay, I called Notes on English Transphobia, but it could be applied to a lot of English.
A lot of just even very basic discourses. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And I'm not sure which is worse.
No, I mean, I think, just almost sometimes the straightforward, fascistic stuff that you get from the American Republicans is easier to deal with because in
It's
Britain,
easier to
yeah,
identify, isn't it? It's easier to target. You don't have to pick it apart as such. It's there and it's overt and it's obvious.
it makes its
Whereas,
arguments. That's the big thing. It actually makes its arguments. Whereas,
right.
like, if you're dealing with English transphobia, the arguments are often foundationally disingenuous, and that's even applying to the arguments that are made in the world. What you tend to encounter is, oh, my friend, my sister, my whatever, they believe this stuff, and they might be a little bit wrong, they might be a little bit misguided, but they can't be bad people. So
Right.
this stuff has to have some credibility, has to be looked at, has to be peaceful. This stuff never actually being defined. So
Right,
just
right.
nothing to discuss. It's just, is this person I don't know who this other person is attached to um, a manifestation of all evil in the world? Because that's
Right, right. I'm missing just the fundamentals of assessment here, the sort of Aurelian look at things. What is each thing in and of itself,
yeah.
separate from those associations.
It's
Yeah,
constantly you have to have the debate, but the people asking you to constantly have the debate have nothing to debate. They have nothing
right.
to actually put up for debate. I mean, if they did, it would be quite simple because all the actual talking points are demonstrably nonsense. But that's what we've got. I mean, there are obviously, the more overt kind, the kind that, work through the muddle enough to become champions of any kind of bigotry. And you can see that, in the racism of the BNP, for example, where they will
Right.
overtly state ideas that are clearly false, like, for example, that humanity has multiple genesis, so that like we are almost separate species to each other, and this is, scientific bunk doesn't even begin to state
Right.
how much nonsense this is, but at least that's something you can like chew on. Like you can actually
Right.
like go through why that's wrong. And of course, those people can be, they have their own rhetorical strategies, especially when, as most people aren't, you're not really prepared to take on arguments of that level of falsity, and they have a huge range of pre-prepared answers to the most obvious surface level objections, which is what they tend
Right.
to receive. Um, but yeah, it's very difficult, I think, in this country where muddling is the standard modus operandi of most people,
Yeah.
and it's a very stunting thing. I think the English imagination when it doesn't try and rise above itself. And there are resources to tap into. This is the country that birthed utopia.
Right. I mean, there's such a rich tradition of us actually doing that, of us actually transcending ourselves in very profound ways.
Yeah.
The whole romantic movement.
Yes. Yeah. There's complexities there, but those people were trying to find something that was both serious and hopeful, which I think is the antithesis of the conservative English mind. They can brook hope as long as it's acknowledged silliness, as long as it's seen as whimsy, as long as it's framed as a mere distraction and a diversion.
It's something you play at, isn't it? As opposed to the brute mechanisms of reality, which is just a machine.
Yeah, and and they see that as an unvarnished, this sort of completely unsentimental worldview. In fact, it's actually got its own sentimentalities and its own.
Of course, it does. It's a morbid sentimentality. Yeah. It's the sentimentality of despair.
But it's very endemic, and there is a tension. Of course, there is. I mean, we talked about Barker, and I actually, as weird as it is to say, and as much as he reacts against the English sensibilities that we've described, he is also a very quintessentially English writer, as is T.M. Foster. In fact, Barker and Foster, I think, beyond both being gay men, they have a similar notion of the liberatory, I think, running through their writing in obviously profoundly different genres. But it's interesting, like, in contrast to the conservatism, the puritanical conservatism of the United States,
which is a different animal.
Yeah.
It's a different animal, isn't it? I mean, that's something that became apparent to me listening to Daniel Harper's podcast, I Don't Speak German, just how profoundly removed even some of the more extreme and, I suppose, what you would call lunatic elements of that movement are from their British equivalents.
It's almost more like I have this intense fascination with the weirder Italian currents of fascism. Because I actually feel that they're prefigurative of the kinds of forms of fascism that we're now seeing in the United States, albeit they were more philosophically serious in a way in the Italian version. I mean, I don't want to overstate it. The likes of Julius Evola is clearly not a great mind. His ideas are bizarre to the highest degree.
But there was an attempt, wasn't there? There was a sincere attempt to varnish these movements with academia.
Whether it's Evola grounding it in perennialist philosophy, which I obviously reject profoundly, but there are very intelligent perennial philosophers. There are very intelligent radical traditionalist types who can definitely put up an argument for their worldview. Or on the other side of the equation, and the fact that Italian fascism had this range in itself is weird for fascism. The futurists and their foundational rejection of the past and their worshipping of violence and war and speed at an aesthetic level. Obviously, these things did not define the mass movements. But interestingly, I feel today, and I think the internet and the headiness of it and the strangeness of it is probably partly to blame for this, but also the fact that it's cropping up in the extreme ideological sphere of the United States is probably partly responsible for this. The fascism that we're getting today, it's more reminiscent of that kind of occultic, extreme ideas fascism.
Right, the almost romanticized version of fascism that has its own borrowed and scavenged and created from whole cloth philosophy and mythology.
And the class content, to be clear, as I'm sure Jack Graham will be shouting if he's listening to this, is exactly the same. Like, there's no the project, however it's done up, remains identical.
Yes, it's absolutely the same. It's window dressing, it's aesthetics, isn't it? Which as we know, the right does so well.
Yes, yeah, and that's, but it is still, I think, illuminating that it takes these forms. I mean, something I was saying to a comrade, Neil Faulkner, who's very, very well versed in all of this. He wrote the book Creeping Fascism along with several other co-authors. And I was talking to him on this point, and I was saying Trump wouldn't have been able to win in Nazi Germany, somebody of that nature,
right?
Because he would have been too overtly obscene. Hitler depicts himself, and obviously the things that Trump did and the things that Hitler did, I don't believe in like historical comparisons. I think they're bugged from the get-go. Like comparing different miseries, different atrocities as a dead end. And I'm not trying to make that comparison between Trump and Hitler in terms of who's worse. That's just ridiculous.
No, that's not the point, is it? The point is that he, by his very nature, would not have been able to ascend.
No, because like if Hitler depicted himself as a family man, a vegetarian,
as a
serious,
a Puritan,
man, a good German. Yeah.
Yeah.
Trump depicted himself as an obscene television media clown. Who predates on women, and that in itself is odd because fascistic misogyny, especially when it's directed at women of the correct race, tends to adopt a hyper paternalistic view.
Right, in a prescriptive sense, doesn't it? It's a prescriptive form of misogyny where it has a very definite idea of where women are supposed to be, and it proclaims to exalt women. That's another thing.
I mean,
rather than demonizing them.
Underneath all the surface, all the obscenity, of course, exists, and and there's no.
Oh God,
and arguably, the sense of them being so above board, so absolutely decent and civilized, and it, I think, creates a greater space for obscenity, a greater
and for abuse, for enshrined abuse,
and I think the obscenity is a part of the point and a part of the appeal of fascism, that you get this space to be obscene. But
I suppose what Trump's very peculiar form of fascism did is it ripped away the veneer.
Yeah.
It tried to exalt the truth of itself, which is is part of the fundamental dirt and obscenity of the whole movement, isn't it? It basically said, oh yeah, women are cattle, and that's right, that's correct.
Its aesthetics are grotesque, and they revel in their grotesquerie, and that's really weird. Like, I don't think that there are many historical parallels. I talked about this a bit in an article I wrote on the alt-right's appropriation of Warhammer 40,000, because I think that
the most bizarre thing.
It is very bizarre, but I think it's actually tackled sometimes the wrong way around. I think the standard view is, look, Warhammer 40,000 clearly is not a pro-fascist piece of art.
Right.
It's grimdark. It comes out of that 1980s punk
sort of 2000 AD anti-authoritarian, anti-Thatcherite, anti-Reagan movement.
Absolutely. But what I think is happening there, in them embracing a set of ideas that seem on a certain level a satire of who they are, is actually not some kind of naive misreading of Warhammer 40,000. But again, just that that embracing of the obscenity. They like the image of worshipping a god emperor who's a rotting corpse is an expression of despair, because they are no longer even pretending that their ideologies aren't expressions of despair. When they talk,
there's a kind of grotesque reappropriation.
Yeah. When they talk about
there,
being,
I suppose,
like black-pilled, which is a concept that comes out of the men's rights movement and the sort of more disturbing ends of that, they are consciously saying that their ideology is nihilistic, and even in their aesthetics, in the Pepe the Frog memes, in the kind of horrible stuff that seeps out of anonymous boards like 4chan.
Right.
There's no pretense of decency.
No, it's a wallowing in, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, you get the feeling that that they wouldn't be out of home in some of the Chaos armies. There's like a wholesale embracing of nihilism. It's a strange thing, not because that wasn't there before, but because I don't think there are the futurists, of course, were there, and they did do some of that. Their worship of war obviously had a feature of the grotesque about it. But even then, those people were put away by the Italian fascists. Like they weren't put into concentration camps in the way that the enemies of fascism were, but they were locked up and kept out of circulation because they were seen as aberrant even by the fascists of the day. It's like those people have sort of exited their prisons and taken over the fascist movements. And there's no real precedent for what happens when the people who are that unmoored from reality and that embracing of destructive nihilism start to take over. And I think that's because they don't have a project. Like in the 1930s, there was a class project in terms of beating back emerging working class movements and then rectifying capitalism. Today, in the context of the decline of profits and the ecological catastrophe, there is no long-term fascist project. The fascist project is world-ending. It's apocalyptic. The Boogaloo people actually are probably the most honest in that sense.
The most sincere,
Yeah. It is quite fascinating to sort of look at these. So I went off on a very
No, it's absolutely superb.
Yeah.
No, this is exactly what we like on the Strange Playgrounds, Rowan. Although I will say, if you don't mind, we'll draw it to a close.
Absolutely, I think 2.5 hours is a good mark.
No, that was absolutely superb. Thank you so much for chatting with me this evening. It's been a blast as per usual. Is there anything that you would like to pimp out?
It's always the easiest. So my pinned tweet at RT_editing it really has all of my links in it.
Links below, ladies and gents.
Thank you. Pleasure as always.
Okay. Always. As for myself, it's the usual, ladies and gents. You can find me knocking about here on Exaggerated Elegy. You can find links to all my published fiction over at strangeplaygrounds.com. New short story collection coming very soon, I'm hoping. Born in Blood Volume 2. And you can also come and chat to me over at Enigmatic Elegy on Twitter, if you fancy it. Until next time, my loves, bye-bye.
Bye.
Ha ha ha!